Hi guys! I thought maybe I would read some of my favorite book, Rosie's Garden by Satomi Ichikawa. The text is by Elizabeth Laird. I've had this book since I was maybe 8. It's been a long time. I love this book. This book is a friend. For Stella and Jessie with love, S.I. For my mother, E.I. The kiss of the sun for pardon, the songs of the birds for mirth. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth. Dorothy Frances Gurney. Chapter 1. A Welcome for Rosie. You see, there's Rosie. There's Granny. Rosie, says Granny happily, you're here at last. Rosie skips into Granny's kitchen and looks around. It's lovely. Everything just as she remembers it. There are flowers everywhere. A jug of irises on the table, honeysuckle on the wallpaper, and crocus growing in pots on the windowsill. There are other interesting things on the windowsill as well. What are those little plants, says Rosie. More flowers, Granny smiles. Pansies and sweet williams, and petunias. But there aren't any flowers on them, says Rosie. There will be soon, says Granny. I'm going to plant them out in the garden tomorrow. Then they'll grow very fast. Can I help, says Rosie? I love gardening. Of course you can, says Granny. You can be my chief assistant. I've got a special trowel and fork just for you to use. But will the flowers come out before I have to go home, says Rosie? Yes, says Granny. Mother says you can stay for the whole summer if you want to. I do want to, says Rosie. I do. Then she notices something she has never seen before. Around Granny's neck is a locket. Rosie opens it. Inside are some little purple violets, rather faded, but still pretty. Where are these from, asks Rosie. It's a long story, says Granny. Let me make myself a cup of tea, and I'll tell you all about it. A Gift of Violets, Chapter 2. My big brother Tom could run so fast, and climb so high, and scramble so quickly over fences that I could never catch up with him, Granny says. Well, one lovely spring day when I was 6 or 7 years old, Mother said that we could go into the woods to look for primroses, but when we got halfway there, Tom met his best friend. I've seen some baby thrushes in a nest, he said. Come along and I'll show you. They ran off and left me all alone in the woods. What did you do? Asked Rosie. I called out and no one answered, so I sat on a tree stump and I cried. That's what I would have done, said Rosie. But crying doesn't get you anywhere, says Granny. So after a while I got up and looked for a path, and at last I found my way home. The boys stayed out all day looking for birds' nests. They even forgot to come home for tea. Was your mother cross? Asked Rosie. Yes, says Granny, and so was I, but not for long, because the next day Tom's friend waited for me all morning in the garden, and when I came out in the afternoon he gave me a bunch of violets. And he said he was very sorry, and he'd never be horrid to me again. And was he? Asked Rosie. No, says Granny. Edward was the kindest man I ever knew. Edward, says Rosie, but that's Grandfather's name. Yes, dear, said Granny, and these are Edward's violets. And she carefully shut the locket. Chapter 3. Granny's Garden. Outside in the garden, Rosie runs up one path and down another. It's perfect, she says. It's the most lovely garden I've ever seen. It's the loveliest garden in the whole world. Chapter 4. A Craze for Tulips. Granny bends down to pick up a withered stalk. What's that? Asked Rosie. It was a tulip, says Granny. It doesn't look very interesting now, but tulips were once the most precious flowers in the world. Tulips did not grow wild in Europe. They came from Turkey nearly 400 years ago. They were rare and special, and everyone loved them for their bright colors because they sometimes had stripes in brilliant shades of red, pink, orange, yellow, and white. In Holland in 1634, there was a mad craze for tulips. People would pay thousands of florins for tulip plants. Some even sold their houses and all their land for just one bulb. They hoped to plant it and produce more bulbs from it, which they could sell for even more money. Not everyone made money out of tulips. One tulip farmer sat down to supper one night to enjoy his usual stew. It tasted unusual. "What did you put in it?" he asked his cook. "Oh, nothing special," said the cook. "Just onions and meat." "Show me the onions," said the farmer. The cook showed him what he had used, and the farmer went mad with rage. "You fool!" he yelled. "You've cooked my best tulip bulbs instead of onions. My supper has cost me 100,000 florins. The tulip craze only lasted for a few years, but Dutch people still love them. Every spring, the tulip fields of Holland are covered with miles of beautiful, brilliant flowers, and the Dutch farmers send out their bulbs to bloom in every corner of the world. Chapter 5. Old Names for Old Flowers. "I wish I knew what all the flowers were called," says Rosie. "You'll soon learn their names," says Granny, "and very ancient some of them are too. Some are even in a poem that's nearly 600 years old. Periwinkle, violet, cowslip, and lily, rose red, rose white, foxglove, and primrose, hollyhock, coriander, peony, ... It doesn't really sound like a poem," says Rosie. "It doesn't rhyme." "No, it doesn't," says Granny. "You'd better make up another one when you know all the flower names yourself." Carnations. These flowers were greatly loved. These flowers were greatly loved in the Middle Ages. They were often used to make garlands and coronets, and came to be called coronation or carnation. Delphinium. The Greeks thought the buds of this flower looked like dolphins, so they called it Delphinos, which is Greek for dolphin. Delphinium comes from Delphinos. Poppy. In the First World War, a Canadian poet, John McCrae, wrote a famous poem about poppies that grew in fields in Flanders, where many soldiers died. Soon people started wearing poppies in honor of the fallen soldiers. Lily. Old painters loved this flower, and often painted the Virgin Mary with lilies, so that it became the symbol of all that is good and beautiful. Hollyhock. The Crusaders probably brought this flower to Europe from its home in the East. They used to make the flowers into a kind of tea and drink it when they had a bad cold. Honeysuckle. Perhaps it is the sweet smell of honeysuckle that makes it so romantic. There's an old superstition that if you bring honeysuckle into a house, a wedding will soon follow. Chapter 6, and the last one we'll read tonight. Lilies of the Valley. These are my favorites! I love honeysuckle, but there's nothing like Lily of the Valley. And, pro tip, they dry really well. So if you cut them at this time of the year and dry them for like 2 weeks, they stay. The shape is really nice. Anyway, Lilies of the Valley. Near the lavender bush in Granny's garden, there's a shy little plant with an even stronger smell. Little white bells hanging from a stalk peep out from its long pointed leaves. "I know what that is," says Rosie, sniffing the air. "Mother has some scent like that in a pretty glass bottle. It's Lily of the Valley, isn't it?" "That's right," says Granny. "The Germans call it Little Bells of May, and the French even have a special day for it. They think it brings good luck." "What do they do?" asks Rosie. On the 1st of May every year, says Granny, the streets of French towns and villages are full of the lovely scent of Lily of the Valley. There are people selling it at every corner, and everyone buys bunches of it to give to their friends. The shops make special displays. Bakers make cakes with iced lily of the valley on them, and sweet sellers sell green and white sweets. How lovely, says Rosie. What about the children? What do they do? They pick big bunches of them, says Granny, or buy them from a flower seller and make them into bouquets. Then they give them to older friends, perhaps to their neighbors, or their aunts, or... She stops. While she has been talking, Rosie has been busy. She has picked a bunch of delicate white flowers, and now she gives it to Granny. Or to the grandmothers, finishes Granny with a smile. To be continued.